Okay, folks, welcome to this throwback review to the series PITT. This came out right around 1992 or so, and this was requested by a viewer who is interested in picking up the Dale Keown Omnibus of PITT. Dale Keown is the artist and writer on PITT. He's most famous for his work on The Incredible Hulk alongside writer Peter David, who famously integrated the Hulk's personalities into a non-transforming Bruce Banner-controlled Hulk. Um, so Dale Keown was a much hailed artist back in the day, and he stayed on Incredible Hulk until about issue 398, and then he was unceremoniously dropped from the book prior to issue 400 because Marvel found out, if I'm not mistaken, that he was in talks with Image to become one of the Image founders. And unfortunately, because of a criminal record he has in Canada, which makes travel between Canada and the United States difficult, he opted out of being one of the Image founders and instead decided to lay low for a little bit and debut his creator-owned property PITT a year or two later. Not very much later, though, because as you'll see, PITT actually makes his debut in Youngblood #4, but I had no knowledge of that back in the day, and so my first experience with the character of PITT came from PITT #1. And so let's go straight into PITT #1, like I did, and find out what it is that I saw at the time. Well, the first thing that I saw was a biker gang, and a biker gang going through New York City at 3 a.m., making the rounds, and they encounter this naked gray alien who's just walking down the street, and of course, being stupid bikers, they can't leave well enough alone, and they attack the guy, and he makes short work of them, eventually making off with their clothes and also talking to himself about how this was barbaric, but yet kill or be killed. It's like there's two consciousnesses at work here. There's actually two different voices at play inside this creature's mind. What that means, we don't know yet, but the gentler of the two says that we're not at war with this planet. We may actually end up playing a role in this planet's salvation. So he gets on a bike that is suddenly big enough to hold him and makes his way into the city. Now, all of this is just way, way too reminiscent of not only James Cameron's Terminator, but also and especially Terminator 2, in which Arnold Schwarzenegger literally goes into a biker bar and tells a biker, I need your clothes, your boots, and your bike. Actually, he says your clothes, your boots, and your motorcycle. And I got to tell you, this was weighing heavy on my mind. Terminator 2 had just come out in 1991, and Dale Keown's PITT #1 came out around 1992. So it seemed like a clear ripoff to me. I know that there's a lot of times when great minds think alike, but this was one of those unfortunate occurrences where the coincidence just felt wrong. And one of the things that really bothered me about this was that, you're going to Image Comics and you're hoping for some sort of originality. I mean, I think Eric Larson's Savage Dragon was massively original just for the idea of having a superhero who was a cop and nothing more. Spawn, although it combined a lot of elements of things like Ghost Rider and other characters like Doctor Strange with his cape. There's a lot of derivative work in Spawn, but at the same time, there's also a lot of originality in how all those pieces are put together. So really, even Rob Liefeld, as large a sack of crap that Youngblood was, that book was slightly original in the idea of a commercial superhero team, where the focus was not so much on superheroics as merchandising. So there were a lot of original elements to the Image founders' original creations, and you wanted to see that same kind of originality come through in PITT, but it really didn't on account of this. I mean, first of all, you've got this giant muscular guy who you're thinking, okay, Hulk, and now you're seeing this scene in which you get a whole bunch of bikers, their clothes and bike taken, and you're thinking Terminator 2. So the elements are coming off more ripped off than anything else. Now, getting back into the story of PITT number 1, we also see that PITT has some sort of psychic connection to a boy named Timmy, who wakes up after having a dream about the attack on the bikers, or, well, the bikers' attack on PITT, really. And so Timmy says, is this night ever going to end? And, that's kind of a weird thing to say at first, because thinking, okay, he had a bad dream, but what about it? But it turns out that when we learn from the dialogue between him and his grandfather that not only is Timmy an orphan, but that they were both involved in some incident that same night. You can see the bandage on the grandfather's head, where they were involved in some sort of altercation. But we don't know anything about that altercation, except we're referred back to it in Youngblood number 4. Now, Youngblood number 4 doesn't give any indication on the cover that there's anything about PITT inside. And yet, there is like a 8-page story of PITT on the inside. And wow, what a dick move by Image to not reference the fact that PITT, the prologue, was in the book. I mean, that's just freaking sad. And what's even more freaking sad is that this appeared in Youngblood, because honestly, 3 issues into Youngblood, I had already determined that this book was a piece of crap, and I didn't want to read it anymore, and so I stopped buying it. So I never saw the prologue of PITT, which starts with him materializing inside a subway where this gang, another gang in New York, is attacking Timmy and his grandfather. So you have PITT materialize into the middle of this mess. He makes short work of the biker gang, and then he also hands a crushed hockey stick to Timmy, saying, don't be afraid, you're a good fighter. They have this psychic link going on already, it seems. And now you've got PITT climbing out into the open and says, I need time to adjust. I'm going to have problems fitting in. I hate it here already. And then the prologue ends. But that really would have been a better opening to PITT number 1 than what we got in PITT number 1. So I'm really sad that Dale Keown didn't make the decision to include that prologue in here, because that also would have been much more informative to the Timmy and his grandfather scene that we just came away from, where Timmy's saying, or where the grandfather, is saying, what a night we've had. Because we don't have any concept of that night. We don't know what happened. The only way we could know what happened is if we had read Youngblood number 4. And so there's no way to know what the grandfather is talking about without that previous information in Youngblood number 4 that we're just not privy to. I know I wasn't at the time. There's a little bit more about a police detective, a female police detective, who starts investigating the subway fight. This is where we learn about a subway fight. And when she and her partner go to investigate the crime scene, we find that there are alien bounty hunters on the scene who are presumably there to find and capture or kill PITT. So that is where PITT number 1 ends. And if that didn't seem like a whole hell of a lot of story, trust me, it wasn't. There was not a lot of meat to the book in terms of actual plot points. Now, there's a lot of dialogue and stuff that goes on back and forth, and of course you've got, like 8 pages of the bikers and PITT in a fight, but that's not really advancing the plot any, to have that much of the book taken up by so few plot points. And that is a major complaint that I have about this first arc in PITT, is that as you'll see as we go further into the book, there's not a lot of story meat to the first arc. when you get into, and not only that, but you also have some amateurish dialogue concerns, because look at this scene. I actually featured this scene in an earlier video of mine that was focused on cussing in comic books. And I swear to God, to this day, I don't know what word goes into that string of characters that represents a cuss word. This really throws a what into my day. The closest thing that I swear that I've been able to think of is turd. This really throws a turd into my day. The problem is that turd is not a cuss word. So why would you cover that up? So I don't know. This is one of those things where I'm just like, what is she saying, and why am I having to deal with wondering about what she's saying? So we get to PITT number 2, and PITT number 2 is where we actually pick up on more complexity in the story. But that's after we go through about 6 to 8 pages of PITT doing nothing but foiling a bank robbery and rescuing the teller who's been taken hostage, or a witness who's been taken hostage. Okay, you just threw away 6 to 8 pages just to throw some action into the book, but this doesn't really advance the story any at all. And so we don't get into the story into the real story of the book until about 7 or 8 pages in, when we have this internal conversation going on, which reveals that there is a stowaway consciousness in PITT's mind, and this consciousness comes from a child of the race of Chakrans, and PITT is a hybrid of the race called the Creed. But he also finds out that he is half human, and that is the hybrid portion of him, is that he's Creed and human, and so he's actually on the world that is responsible for part of his DNA. And not only that, but the boy, Timmy, who he encountered earlier, is his genetic match. So there's a layer of mystery that gets added on in issue 2 that would have been really nice to see in issue number 1, and that is one of the detriments of the overall arc, is that there's a lot of complexity that is saved for later in the book that really needs to be introduced earlier on. Now, the bounty hunters, also detecting the genetic match that is Timmy, come for Timmy looking for PITT. Now, PITT arrives and makes short work of the bounty hunters, and then explains to Timmy a little bit of his backstory. There is a consciousness residing in him called Jareb, and they're in a state of shared consciousness. Jareb exists within PITT's subconscious mind, is able to transmit thoughts, yada, yada, yada. And from here, we jump to the big bad of the series, who is asking for a report from one of his underlings, and he finds out from his underling that their assault on the planet Chakra, which is from where this Jareb consciousness hails, was unsuccessful. And he's asked about a child, and the child had his consciousness melded by a seer with the last standing soldier, which was PITT. So now we kind of get an idea of what's happened prior to the opening of the series. This big bad sent PITT, along with other soldiers, to the world Chakra to destroy a child. And instead of being destroyed, the child's consciousness was melded with PITT, and then PITT wound up on Earth. So that's kind of the backstory that's happened behind the scenes. And now we have the big bad who's like really, really pissed off about that fact. And, because apparently not only has he lost pursuit of the child he was just trying to destroy, but also PITT was engineered from his own DNA and is the perfect soldier. So, it's a double loss. He lost his target, and now he's lost his hunter. So he's not happy with the underling, and he kills the underling, and that is it as far as PITT number 2 goes. There's not a whole lot of meat there either. And as we get into PITT number 3, we're going to see even less meat, because what happens in PITT number 3 is that we first get about 6 or 8 pages of throwaway regarding PITT scaring some hunters in the forest. And then we jump to a scene with Timmy and his grandfather, where the FBI are cleaning up the scene and asking what the heck went on with this whole bounty hunters coming and crashing into their place, and PITT coming and rescuing them. And then in the body of one of the bounty hunters, you have the big bad himself emerge and capture Timmy. And capturing Timmy triggers a psychic reaction in PITT, and then PITT goes off to save Timmy, and that's it. That's all there is in this book. So everything that's in this book can be summarized in those few short scenes that I just showed you. So there's not a whole hell of a lot of meat in here. And then last but not least, we have PITT number 4, which thankfully does not contain 6 to 8 throwaway pages, unless you want to count like 6 to 8 throwaway pages of people fighting the big bad, whose name is Zoivod. So Zoivod, the big bad, is he knows that PITT has the Child of Future Light, very prophetic title, within him, and so he discards Timmy. PITT, once he gets a hold of Timmy, transfers the consciousness of Jareb into Timmy, both to heal Timmy from his injuries and also to safeguard Jareb. And so PITT returns to the fight with Zoivod. We also have the police detective show up on the scene, and it turns out that she's a superhero too, with the name Reiki, and she's going to, contribute what little she can, which really isn't much at all. Neither PITT nor Reiki together, they can't defeat Zoivod. It actually is the boy who wakes up with Jareb's powers who defeats Zoivod. So Zoivod is blown up, but we learn from PITT that Zoivod cannot be killed. His physical form was destroyed, but his life force is still continuing somewhere else in the universe. Timmy is unconscious, but he will live, and Jareb is now in Timmy's body, sharing consciousness with him. So, that is the new status quo that is laid down. And that's it. That's all we get. So, so all of this whole series, which makes up the whole first arc of PITT, it's really not a lot of meat there, and it doesn't feel like we get a lot for our money. And that's sad, because when you go and you read later issues of PITT, you actually come up with many more layers of complexity added on. Timmy starts developing psychic powers on account of his being inhabited by Jareb. There's a whole arc about what happens to Jareb and what happens to Timmy. Do they ever get separated? You also have to answer the mystery of PITT's human origin, and why is it that he and Timmy are a genetic match? And then you get into a arc where PITT has to sacrifice himself and winds up being bumped 5 years into the future, where then he later encounters a teenage Timmy who has retained psychic powers. There's a lot of complexity that gets added in over the series, and you can see that Dale Keown's writing improves over the course of the series, but this is such a clunky start that I'm rather pleased to know that his work is going to be re-released in an omnibus form, because I think it's only in that form that, number one, it's going to hold your interest, and number two, you're going to get to see the whole length and breadth of Dale Keown's writing for the series, because he does get better as he goes along. It's just that you don't see much of it in this initial arc. So as far as whether to pick up the book or not, I think it's a worthy contribution to the library, just to see how a new writer develops over time, and to show how that creativity can blossom over time, because the book starts out and it seems very one note and very predictable and very doesn't really have a lot of substance to it. But the more substance that gets injected to it over time, the more it becomes a worthwhile read. And so I'm glad that when people are able to experience PITT for the first time through this omnibus, they'll be able to go and see that entire arc of development. So hopefully this PITT book coming out will include all of PITT's prior appearances, both Youngblood #4 and the PITT 20 issue series itself. There was also a 3 or 4 issue series called PITT Crew, which dealt with PITT's backstory somewhat. And there was also a one-shot special called PITT in the Blood, and there was also a team up between PITT and the Garth Ennis character, the Darkness. So that I don't know if Dale Keown's got the rights to reprint anything to do with the Darkness, so it'll be interesting to see if that gets included in the series. So we'll see. You know, by all means, keep watching Indiegogo for when Dale Keown's PITT Omnibus campaign comes through. I think that'll probably be kicked off later this year, and you might want to take a look at it. Take a look at and look at beyond the first few issues, because it's really once you get past that the complexity and creativity really start to bloom. It's just something you don't get in the first few issues. I'm Mike Partika. Thank you for watching. Please do subscribe. Please share this on Twitter where I cannot. Feel free to hook up with me on Gab, which is my social media choice and a point of necessity, having been permabanned from Twitter. And also, please feel free to make suggestions about what I should review next. This PITT review came as a reader suggestion, and so I would be happy to look at anything else any of y'all might have an interest in. And once again, do subscribe, hit like on the video if you cared for it, and I will talk to you later.